Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and I am so excited to be celebrating 10 years of meaningful conversations with you. As we step into our new primetime hour, it's such an honor to share this exciting new chapter with you. So whether you're starting your day out, headed to work, or listening from wherever you are, this hour is designed to bring you thoughtful dialogue, fresh insight, and inspiring stories so you can make every moment count. So thank you for being here with me today, and let's dive in. We're here today with special guest, Lisa Skinner, who's here to share with us her new book, Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's, Its Secret Faces. What if the truth about Alzheimer's could change how we care, connect, and prepare for the future? I'm sure many of us would like to know about that. Lisa Skinner is an expert in the field of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. In her 20-year career as a community counselor and regional director of senior care facilities, she has helped thousands of families find the best care options for their loved ones. She holds an administrator's license through the California Department of Social Services. As a trainer, advisor, and public speaker, she has dedicated her career to teaching people these skills to effectively manage brain disease. So welcome to the show, Lisa Skinner.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks so much for having me on today. I appreciate it very much.
Oh my goodness, what a great honor it is to have you here and to talk about your book. What inspired you to write this?
Well, there is a backstory to this, and it started 50 years ago when I went to visit my grandmother one day. As a matter of fact, I had just gotten my driver's license and I wanted to show it off to her. She only lived a few miles from my family home, so I told my mom I was headed over there, drove over there. She invited me in. No sooner did we sit down in the living room, and I just thought this was going to be an ordinary, typical catch-up conversation. She started frantically telling me about birds that were living in her mattress, and they came out at night and pecked her face. And then she pointed to the living room floor and asked me if I saw all the rats running around. And then she continued telling me that there were these men that were constantly breaking into her home. They were stealing her jewelry. They were eating all her food, so she was always hungry. She said they were only leaving her, a few scraps of bread. And she was terrified. She said, I just know that the plan is to do away with me and just take over my life. And I could tell by looking at her that she was clearly terrified. But other than that, I didn't have a clue what was going on, what was wrong with her. These were the most far-fetched stories I'd ever heard in my life, so not characteristic for my sweet little grandmother. But I came from the generation where you don't contradict your elders, you don't argue. And so I said, my goodness, Grandma, this must be terrifying for you. So basically what I did was I acknowledged her. I validated how she was feeling, and then I offered to try to find a way to fix the problem for her, or the problems. Unbeknownst to me, that was actually the effective way to respond to somebody who was, as it turns out, was having delusion. The birds that she was telling me about was a false belief or a delusion. The rats were a hallucination, which is very common with dementia. And paranoia and suspiciousness would kind of fit in with this tale of the men. And I just sat there. I was just absolutely dumbfounded, but I was very concerned about her because I could tell that she really believed everything she was telling me. This was, not April Fool's Day or anything like that. So I went home and I confronted my mother, and I told her the stories that Grandma had been sharing with me. And I said, "Did you know something was wrong with her? And if so, why didn't you tell me and prepare me?" I said, I was completely blindsided. And her response to me was, "Yes, your grandmother's been diagnosed with what they called back then senile dementia, which is synonymous with Alzheimer's disease. And we're not going to talk about this anymore. Do you understand?" And I said, "No, I don't understand. This is serious." But that was really the mindset back then. And then following in my grandmother's footsteps, I've had 7 more of my family members who have lived with one of the brain diseases that causes dementia symptoms. And then when I went to college, I decided to get my degree in human behavior because I was always been so fascinated with the way people act. I mean, they clearly act differently in social situations versus organizational environments. And I answered a job after I graduated. I answered an ad for a job, and the name of the position was a community counselor, and it was for a big assisted living corporation that also had memory care. And I thought it would be a really good fit for me because my job was to counsel the families, to do the assessments, to do care plans, and to help them kind of, onboard their families into residency. And I realized that this really had to be my calling. I never, when I was growing up, I never thought, oh, when I grow up, I'm going to work with people living with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. It just kind of found me. And it turned out to be the absolute perfect fit for me because I really, really understood what they were going through because my family had been through it 8 times. And I knew what limited resources were available for families. Even back then, it's a little better now. I've been doing this for 30 years now. But I was also well aware of the struggles. And the main thing was the clear lack of understanding about what family members and care partners can expect on a day-to-day basis. Because I realized early in my career that most people really associate cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. There are over 100 known brain diseases that cause similar symptoms that we call dementia. And the common theme that I discovered early on was most people associate dementia with short-term memory loss and confusion. And as I found out that memorable day at my grandmother's house, that all these other behaviors are a result of the changing brain due to the damage being done by one of these brain diseases. So that's kind of, or I call it my yellow brick road. I really didn't know where I was headed, but that's where I ended up, and I've never looked back. It was just the perfect choice for me.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share that story with us. It must have been really startling as a young person to just be confronted with that, but it sounds like you dealt with that so well.
Well, I think if it hadn't been for the fact of the way I was raised to, you have the utmost respect for your elders, I might have reacted differently. So that kind of saved me from
Hmm.
arguing with her or saying, Grandma, that's the craziest stories I've ever heard. So then I learned after I actually went into the profession that the effective responses are counterintuitive to the way we instinctively want to respond to stories like that. And these are very, very common occurrences that happen with people living with dementia, especially starting about the mid stage when they're really losing a lot of their cognitive function abilities.
So let's dive into that a little bit. So, how can people distinguish between normal aging and forgetfulness and mild cognitive impairment and dementia?
Well, that is another aspect of brain diseases that does make that differentiation so difficult and so challenging. Because in the very early stages of a brain disease like Alzheimer's that is developing in a person's brain, they're either asymptomatic, in other words, they're not showing any symptoms at all, and people can actually live with Alzheimer's disease and some of these other brain diseases for up to 10 years and not show any signs of it. And then as it progresses to about the mid stage, that's when it becomes a little more obvious that there's something other than just normal forgetfulness. So, this is the very reason why physicians typically don't diagnose any of these diseases until a person is well into the mid stage where the symptoms are pretty obvious. But what I tell people, because we all have those little memory hiccup moments, that's what I call them, where we'll walk into a room and you look around and go, I have no idea why I just walked in here. And then you walk out and get halfway back down your hall. It's like, oh, yeah, now I remember. Or you forget a person's name when you're having a conversation with somebody. Or you forget where you put your keys. Or maybe your reading glasses are sitting on top of your head and you don't know where you put them. These are all normal occurrences with what we call normal forgetfulness that typically starts around the age of 40. But where the significance really shines a red flag, shines a light on being something more serious than normal aging forgetfulness, is when the memory losses, these little episodes, become more frequent, more severe, and then they start to actually have a dramatic impact on our day to day lives. We can't function the same way we did when our brains were healthier. So that would look like starting to repeat yourself, like maybe asking the same question. This is a very common scenario. A person might start asking the same question to whomever they're talking to over and over and over again in the same conversation, just back to back, because they don't remember that they had just asked, their husband or their daughter that same question, or repeating stories in the same conversation over and over and over again. It's like, Mom, you just told me that 10 times, doesn't remember. Having difficulty just, with balancing a checkbook, for example, or even putting a simple grocery list together, which is something that most of us as adults have been doing for decades. And that becomes a very difficult task. So these are the things that we look for to really kind of raise our awareness that there's might be something a little bit more serious developing than just once in a while having a little memory lapse and for most of us who have experienced that, the name comes back in your head, or you remember why you walked into that room. But that is normal for most of us, and I think most of us have experienced that. But the things that I just mentioned, or forgetting how to work a simple appliance, like you've been going into your kitchen for decades and you know exactly how to set that coffee maker up, that becomes a almost an impossible task for people who are mid-stage or later with a disease that's causing dementia.
I know that your book is described as providing an unconventional path to peace of mind. Can you share on that for us?
Well, my grandmother's story actually illustrates a lot of what that means because of what I mentioned, that the effective responses that we now practice is very different from when I started out 30 years ago professionally. We practiced a methodology called reality orientation therapy. That was the kind of the state of the art approach to communicating with somebody who is experiencing these hallucinations and memory lapses and things like that. And we corrected them. So if somebody insisted, like my grandmother, that birds were living in their mattress and that they came out at night and pecked their face, the therapy would be to correct them. We wanted to steer them back into our reality. Now, what we discovered through trial and error and a lot of heartache was that a story like that might not sound believable to somebody that has a healthy brain, but to the person that is living with a brain disease that causes dementia, they believe it 1,000%. It's real to them. It is their reality. They're not, the two realities are not congruent and they're not aligned with one another. But what we learned is that there's absolutely nothing anybody could say that could convince somebody that whatever it is they're telling you, even if it does sound outrageous and far-fetched, isn't true. And this is kind of how the new state-of-the-art methodology for communicating with people living with dementia came about, because the old way of trying to steer them back into the healthy person's reality created more tension, more anxiety, anger, frustration, because the people who were believing what they're telling you felt frustrated and dismissed and not validated. And the point is they believed whatever it is they're telling you is the truth. So what came out of that is what we practice, because it works, it's effective, called a person-centered approach to dementia care. And it's really meeting them where they are in their reality and joining their reality. So it's the communication skills now are to acknowledge how they're feeling, to validate how they're feeling, to help them feel safe and secure, and to offer to help find a solution to whatever it is they are fixated on and concerned about and frightened about, just like I described with my grandmother. So that's what I practice. I'm a certified dementia practitioner, and I called it unconventional approach because it's not normal for us to join somebody else's reality when we know that what they're telling us could not possibly be true. But what we learned through trial and error is that's the only effective way to respond to somebody else's beliefs due to the damage being done to their brains by one of these brain diseases.
So, how can people minimize their risk of developing like Alzheimer's or dementia disease up to 40%?
There are so many risk factors that have been uncovered in the last 20, 30 years that we were not aware of before. We still do not know exactly what causes Alzheimer's disease or some of these other brain diseases like Lewy body disease and frontotemporal dementia. But a lot of scientific studies are now evidence-based that there are these risk factors that definitely play a role in either increasing a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or minimizing that risk. There's a whole host of these risk factors. There are 4 of them that we call non-modifiable. And the reason why they're non-modifiable is because if these 4 risk factors that I'm going to share with your audience in just a second applies to any individual person, they basically stack up against you. And the more of these risk factors that apply to any one individual, the higher their risk becomes of developing Alzheimer's. Now, I just want to say to reassure everybody, as I'm sharing these risk factors, if somebody's listening and say, oh my gosh, that applies to me, that applies to me, and they're thinking, I'm definitely going to get Alzheimer's disease, that's not true at all. You can have all the risk factors against you and still live out the rest of your life with no cognitive decline. We know that this disease does not discriminate against anybody, and it can show up in anybody at any time. But knowing what the risk factors are can help a lot of us implement better choices for ourselves to actually minimize that risk. So the 4 non-modifiable risk factors, the number 1 is age. So the older we get, the higher our risk becomes of developing Alzheimer's disease. It typically shows up starting at about the age of 65, with the exception of what's called early onset Alzheimer's. It's a rarer form of Alzheimer's, but it shows up before the age of 65. And then for every 5 years that we age after 65, our risk increases even more. So by the time a person, people are 85 years old, 1 in 3 people will be showing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Gender plays a role. More females develop Alzheimer's disease than men. Our race, there are several race backgrounds that increase a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And then genetics plays a role in increasing our risk. So I mentioned I've had 8 family members. 5 of those were blood relatives. So that kind of puts me in a higher risk category because 5 blood relatives of mine have had one of these brain diseases. And then the other 3 were through marriage. So, and I know this about myself. So, I know I'm at an increased risk, but that still doesn't mean that I will be the one to develop Alzheimer's disease. And then we have a huge list of risk factors that we call modifiable, because every one of the modifiable risk factors can be managed, treated, or we can implement lifestyle choices into our daily routines that can help negate that risk factor from increasing our risk of developing Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of medical conditions Heart disease is the number one, but again, it's treatable under a doctor's care with exercise, proper diet, medication management. Diabetes is another medical condition that increases a person's risk. Um, Sleep apnea is one that has been discovered and is evidence-based that if you don't get quality sleep and go into that deep, deep sleep, that increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Another one that is becoming um, very concerning to the medical community is hearing loss, is now right up there as one of the biggest risk factors for increasing our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But treatable, manageable with hearing aids. Sleep apnea, manageable with a CPAP machine. So these are all things that I think it's very important for people to be aware of so they can make better choices for themselves and lower that risk or decrease that risk. And then there's diet. We now know that the worst foods that we can ingest that will increase our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is eating ultra processed foods. And then processed foods is the next one. So it's recommended that we follow something like a MIND diet or a Mediterranean diet that has more complex carbohydrates versus simple carbohydrates, leaner meats, leafy green vegetables. These are all now scientifically evidence-based that it can make a huge difference. And then getting, regular exercise on a weekly basis has shown to minimize our risk. So there's a lot of things that we now know that may play a role in increasing a person's risk. Air pollution. We now know air pollution, the toxins, the microplastics that they have found in autopsies in the brains of people are another known risk factor. So there's a lot of risk factors out there, but we now know that there are things we can do that can help us minimize that risk of it contributing to us developing one of these brain diseases.
So, what can families do to proactively prepare for a loved one being diagnosed?
Well, there's a lot of things that people can do to prepare. And I would say in the 30 years that I've been practicing, most people wait until a crisis occurs. And I would say one of the first things families should do when their parents, let's say, or their grandparents are still of sound mind, of healthy mind, is to sit down as a family and talk about what their loved ones' end of life wishes are. A lot of seniors these days are preferring to stay home in their own homes as long as they possibly can. So if this is something that your loved one is wishing, put it on the table, get it out in the open, and then have a plan of how you can possibly make that happen. It's not going to work for every single person living with cognitive decline, but it can work for a long, long time. And what I've seen, Marianne, is they don't have these conversations and get these wishes defined and planned out. And then it comes to the point where their loved one, their parent or the grandparent are no longer capable of helping to make these decisions and let them know what their wishes are. And I've seen so much guilt and just despair come out of being put in that situation because we all want to do right by our loved ones. And if we are put in a position that we have to make those decisions, then most of us are going to not know if we're making the right decision. I don't know if this is what my mom would want. So to avoid that, it's the early, or even if they never develop Alzheimer's disease, it's a good family discussion to have of end of life care decisions. Do they want to do not resuscitate form? Maybe there's exceptions to that. So all of that should be laid out and everybody understand and on the same page and who's going to do what and be responsible for what. And then the other thing that I recommend, because I have seen it so many times over the decades, is, and I mentioned it earlier, people don't know what to expect from this long, long journey that we call dementia. My grandmother ended up living with it for 20 years after that fateful day that I went to her house. The average is 8 to 15. Some people live longer than 20 years, but you think about that for a minute, and it's a long, long time to try to maintain a healthy, productive relationship with somebody that you're constantly at odds with. And that's what happened with the old methodology, constantly at odds, constantly under stress, because trying to correct and trying to steer them back into the healthy person's reality. And what we now know to be effective, you can avoid all that and experience much more positive outcomes together and enjoy the time that you're spending together. But that takes knowledge, because it's not comfortable to change what's instinctive to us, which is to correct or to argue, or that's our instinctive response to a lot of the things that come up, that we see with dementia and the way the brain's changing. So it takes a lot of skill, it takes a lot of education, it takes a lot of implementation to where it becomes more second nature than having to stop and think, okay, well, what's the best way I should respond to this situation? And those things come up on a daily basis. There are so many triggers that create behavioral changes and really severe behavioral changes. And because they eventually lose the ability to articulate what their want or their need is, it's up to the caregivers and the family members to figure it out, to really kind of through process of elimination. Okay, what just happened here? And then you have to really stop and think, what could have triggered this behavior that I'm seeing? And then know how to diffuse it and de-escalate it. And that is a difficult thing to achieve and to master, but it's doable. It's very, very doable. And I have seen people live just incredibly meaningful, purposeful, joyful lives, just by having a different approach that actually does work.
What would you like readers and our listeners to take away from your book?
The book was really written as to give people a fundamental, better understanding of what to expect when somebody is living with one of these diseases that causes dementia. So it establishes a baseline for the behaviors that show up, for the progression of the disease and the different symptoms that you can expect to see as they go through the different stages. So it's really The purpose of that book is really to have a starting place that is more in depth than just, oh, my mom was just recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, so she probably won't remember a lot of things as she progresses through it, and she'll be confused a lot. I think everybody can kind of get a sense just from this conversation that it is so much more complex than just those two things. But people don't know what those other things are and what they look like, and that they are part of the disease. That, if somebody's claiming that their deceased husband is alive and well and waiting for them at home, and you know darn well that they passed away years ago, that you're not going to just instinctively argue with them and say, Mom, what are you talking about? Dad passed away 5 years ago. He couldn't possibly be waiting for you at home. She believes that he is. So there's a lot of things, situations like that, scenarios that come up that catch us off guard unless we are aware that these things do occur because of the damage that's been done to our brains by these diseases. So that is the other place that I would start, besides having the wishes identified and plans made for them. And then the thing that is scary is the World Health Organization and the Alzheimer's associations are preparing us now that by the year 2050, if we don't find a cure or a treatment, the number of people who are expected to develop Alzheimer's disease just in the next 24 years will triple from the number of people living with it today. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is the odds of it happening to a lot more millions of families is very real. So if it does touch your family, then maybe you'll be more prepared to know how to prepare for the long road ahead of your family if they, are kind of thrust into this situation.
Well, Lisa, what's a website people can connect with you on and learn more about your work?
My website is mindingdementia.com. I have a lot of information on my website. I offer actually a complimentary blueprint. You can go on there and just put your email address in, and it's all of the medical documents and financial documents like power of attorney, all the ones that people should be aware of. If this does touch your family and you have a meeting with an elder care attorney or a financial planner, you will be aware that these documents exist. And then maybe you could say, well, will we be needing this one? And then they can create a customized plan for your family's individual circumstances. So that's available. And I also offer a weekly newsletter that's filled with tips and updated information that should be valuable to a lot of people if they are experiencing this.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thanks so much again for having me. I appreciate it. And have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's, Its Secret Faces. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.